Background information. The Bush v. Gore case occurred in late 2000 and involved conflict of Florida's votes. In most states, including Florida, the candidate that has earned the most popular vote earns all of the state's representative vote. On November 8, 2000, Florida reported that Bush had won the popular vote with 48.8% of voters. This then granted him Florida's representative vote. However, because his margin of victory was less than 0.5% of total votes casted, 1,784, the votes were recounted and his margin of victory dropped yet again to 327. Gore then called for a manual recount of 4 counties: Volusia, Palm Beach, Broward, and Miami-Dade. Gore chose only counties that had been known to vote Democratic in order to gain an advantage. However, these states were not able to meet the deadline of November 14th. Katherine Harris, the Florida Secretary of State, was then appointed to determine if counties that needed an extension were granted one. After a review of the submissions from the counties, Harris granted no counties the extension, and Florida stood by its report that Bush had won the Florida division.
Conflict. The two conflicts in the Bush v. Gore case were whether the Florida recounts were unconstitutional and what was to be done if the recounts weren't constitutional. The constitutionality of the recounts were called into question because of a lack of statewide voting recount standards, meaning that 2 voters could have marked their ballots identically, but the ballot in one county would be counted, while the ballot in a different county would be rejected. Because of the December 12th state deadline for selecting electors to submit the state's choice for president to Congress, there was left no time for recounts to be made before the deadline. Result: the 2 decisions of the Bush v. Gore case were 7-2 in favor of Florida's recount being unconstitutional because of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, and 5-4 in favor of there being no constitutionally valid recount that could be made before the December 12th deadline. Therefore, Bush became president from original counts.
Majority opinion. All of the Supreme Court justices except Stevens and Ginsburg argued that because it would be impossible to ensure that all Florida counties and precincts carried out a recount using the same standards for determining if a hanging or dimpled Chad counted as a legal vote, a recount would violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment by unfairly excluding some votes on the basis of county. This was the less controversial of the 2 majority opinions that were issued. In another 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court argued that since the Florida legislature may have planned on selecting its electors by December 12th, which would be consistent with existing federal law at the time, that there was no time to conduct a recount. This is the specific provision that led to George Bush being elected president.
Dissenting opinion. Justice Stevens argued that once a state decides to hold a popular vote, or in this case, a recount, that the Constitution mandates each vote be considered despite deadlines. Although some Florida counties had discriminated against ballots that did not follow certain protocols, such as the improper removal of Chads, Florida state law dictates that any ballot revealing intent was a valid vote, and therefore 60,000 votes have been ignored unconstitutionally and must be considered. Justice Soter argued that the Supreme Court should not assume that the votes could not be counted by the deadline and should allow the courts to attempt the task that they had initiated. Justice Ginsburg argued that the Supreme Court was overruling a decision from a state court that was achieved constitutionally and correctly within the boundaries of state court justices in reference to state laws. Justice Breyers reasserted that it was not within the Supreme Court's jurisdiction to take the case, as well as to assume that the state court would not have time for a recount. He also argued that the harm dealt from a lack of a recount was disproportionate to the harm dealt by any state court decision.
The Constitution. The Supreme Court ruled that the Florida Supreme Court's decision to have a statewide recount violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The Equal Protection Clause guarantees to individuals that their ballots cannot be devalued by later arbitrary and disparate treatment. Although the recount could have been fair in theory, it was unfair in practice. The process was tainted by ordering recounts in specific districts and using different methods of vote counting for the different areas. Florida's standard that a legal vote is one where there is a clear indication of the intent of the voter couldn't guarantee that the votes could be constitutionally counted. Therefore, under the 14th Amendment, the court ruled that no constitutionally fair recount could be held, leading Bush to be the winner of the 2000 election.
Group opinion. After reviewing the details of the Al Gore versus Bush Supreme Court case, our group came to the conclusion that both of the majority opinions issued by the Supreme Court was flawed. With respect to the 7-2 decision that a Florida recount would violate the Equal Protection Clause of Amendment 14 of the Constitution, our group found that that logic was flawed because although it is true that inconsistent standards for a Florida recount could have caused some voters to lose their vote, it's also true that the Supreme Court decision ultimately caused every single person who cast a vote with a dimpled or hanging chad to have their vote not counted, which actually denied more voters the opportunity to have their vote count for the election. With respect to the vote that was 5-4 regarding the December 12th deadline for the election of electors, we found that this logic was flawed because the purpose of the Supreme Court is to review federal law and make changes in its interpretation as necessary. If the Supreme Court felt that a recount would have benefited the electoral process, it would have been entirely within its right to amend the date for the election of electors from December 12th to a later date as appropriate.